Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming so punctually after the coffee break. I hope you've had a nice break. I have great pleasure in introducing the two speakers to the African Storybook session. Bonny Norton, Professor Bonny Norton from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and Dr. Mary McKenna. You can find out more about them in the program and also for Bonny on her wiki page. I learned that she has her own wiki page, so anyone who wants to know more about Bonny can go there. Bonny is the advisor to this very exciting open access resource, which she's going to tell you a little bit about in a minute. The program will be, Bonny will speak for 20 minutes, and then Mary will also speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the floor after that. I hope you're all sitting comfortably. Let's hear about the Storybook program.
Thank you very much, Sheila. You know, it's very interesting when people talk about stories. Somehow, they don't always have a legitimacy, either in the academic world or in the wider community. People think, you know, what are stories? You know, now let's get down to business. And when I learned about this project, the African Storybook project, I realized that in fact, the power of this project is phenomenal. And it's precisely because it's harnessing the power of stories to make a difference in the lives of children, but doing so in the most imaginative and creative and powerful way. So what I'm hoping to do in the session today is to take you on a journey and to tell you a story, the story of the African Storybook, but to show you also, in a sense, what you have to gain from this particular project. The structure of the presentation then is, what problem are we trying to solve in this project, and what are the key features, and particularly what you'll see is the growth and the impact of this project. And it's partly because it is harnessing the digital, and we've talked a lot at this conference about the digital and possibilities of the digital, but what we haven't necessarily seen is how can we actually harness the digital in creative and exciting ways. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a project called the Global African Storybook Project that is entirely the initiative of Liam Doherty, who is a PhD student in my department at UBC, just to show you what energy this kind of project and excitement the project instills in young people who see the potential of technology, not only for the confines of the project, but also for a global community. And then we'll look at the case study, for example, in Nepal, and Mary's going to talk about the exciting work that is actually happening not far away from here. And the last point is everything is online, so you don't need to kind of heart racing, taking notes. You can simply Google African Storybook Project. Everything is there. Bonny Norton African Storybook Project, it's there. There's YouTube videos, talks, podcasts, and you can also just Google Global African Storybook Project and you'll get to it. So we do just need to be reminded, as we have at this conference, what is the problem? And just again the data, because the data is terrifying when it comes to the concerns of young people. And if you look at the Global Monitoring Education for All Global Monitoring Report, 2013-2014, what we see is, in the North American context, 96% of children in North America stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum reading standards, which is remarkable. But in sub-Saharan Africa, 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum standards. That is huge. That is a challenge, and that is a challenge, as I see it, for us who have resources, who have training, to take very seriously the challenges facing young people, and of course not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but of course in many parts of the world. And just to remind ourselves, as we've talked about here at this conference, the ample research showing that students are quicker to learn to read and acquire other academic skills when first taught in the mother tongue. But, and this is the crucial point, they also learn a second language more quickly than those initially taught to read in an unfamiliar language. And this is a UNICEF report. Bottom line though, there are very few books available in the mother tongue, not only in Africa, but many parts of the world. And that's exactly what the African Storybook is trying to address. It's an organization that's run by, initiated by the South African Institute for Distance Education, largely funded by Comic Relief in the UK, and also harnessing the digital. And the digital, at this point in time, that what's so exciting about the project is precisely that there is sufficient development in the digital to start thinking about ways in which we can harness it in creative and innovative ways. What we're dealing with the ASP is basically an interactive website where we've got hundreds of stories that can be downloaded, uploaded, read, and adapted for use. And if you look at how we get these stories, of course there are multiple ways. We get them from published stories, donated stories, teachers donate stories. But the important point is that all these stories are available in an African language as well as English. And the logic of that is that, very pragmatically, you need to have one common language that most people understand, because otherwise you can't translate from one story to another. And also because the vision of this project is what we call the development of multilingual literacy. In other words, we recognize that people enjoy and benefit from the development of literacy in the mother tongue, but that also many parents, communities want also access to a language of wider communication, and certainly English in sub-Saharan Africa is very important. We've also, though, got many stories in French, and we have some in Portuguese, and in fact we have one in Spanish as well. So I'm involved in this project because I'm the research advisor of the project. I'm at the University of British Columbia. I've done extensive work in Africa for many, many years. And in this picture, actually, is Tessa Welch. She's the project director. And I'm sitting over there. And this was a conference that we organized a couple of years ago. And it's the power of partnerships, the academic, the research world, and the NGO world working, I think, in very productive ways. We're taking very seriously that if you want to go digital, how do you deal with low resource contexts? How do you deal with rural areas where bandwidth is low? And this, again, is where we try to be as creative as we possibly can, where you're looking at projectors, a battery that are run on solar power, battery-run projectors. We do have print options as well, low-cost storage. So anything and everything that is available, we are trying to tap into so that it's not just children in urban areas who can access the digital, but also those in more remote communities. So we've been working pilot sites of Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. But it's very exciting because the project has such amazing potential that what we see is that we've actually moved. We're working also in Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Tanzania, and as soon as people, in a sense, learn about the project, they say to us, "When are you coming to Sudan?" And we say, in a sense, we're already in Sudan because of the open architecture of the project. Any story can be translated into any language. So it's only limited by the imagination of the people involved. So just to show you, for example, this was in 2014, which was not very long ago. We had 640 translated stories from 120 core stories. And you see we've got them spread between Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. But now, and this is just really 1 year later, what you see, we started then, this is our 2004, and if you can see down here, I'll read it out, but we've actually got, as of June 2015, we have over 400 stories, which is pretty amazing. Birgit yesterday in her talk was talking about 4 Tanzanian stories, and with respect, but 404 stories. These are all unique stories that are now translated into 1,426 stories, and of course the number keeps rising. And we've now got 53 African languages, and the number keeps rising too. And as I say, we've got all of these are all in English as well, but also there are over 100 in French and also in Portuguese and 1 in Spanish. So UBC has been, my institution has been involved because I've also been very active in training African students at UBC with the support, for example, of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. And this, for example, is a picture of Sam Andema, who is the policy advisor of the African Storybook. He was a PhD student of mine at UBC and now has returned to Uganda. And we have at UBC also worked very actively with policy makers, this is in Uganda, but also, very actively also in rural areas. This is Juliet Tembe, who was also one of my PhD students, who is now the in-country coordinator in Uganda, who is doing just remarkable work in that part of the world. So I've also got Espen Stranger Johansson. Espen, you can see a little picture over here, is just an absolutely remarkable student. His technological skills are just stunning. He was actually a student of Birgit's. He did his master's with Birgit, and he's doing his PhD with me. And he's the webmaster of the research network of the project. And of course, as I feel so privileged really to be working with people with energy and talent. But this is a project that can harness that kind of talent and energy. So one of the things we have, for example, is a research network, and again, you can just Google it all. And we have lots of conversations. We've got a blog on this network, and we talk about some of the problems, challenges, possibilities, new innovations, and it's amazing to see the kinds of conversations that are happening within this research network. And as you see here, just to reiterate, we're looking at digital storytelling for multilingual literacy development. That is the key. And just to show you some of my own research, some of you may know I do a lot of work in identity, a lot of research on identity. And this picture just captures the fact that people's identities shift as they become technologically more comfortable and competent. So you see this young woman who actually has a video recorder. She kind of shifts her identity from being, a student who maybe doesn't have that much power in her society to being a photographer. And in the role of photography, with the identity photographer, she has a lot more power in her society. And she can actually go into a police commissioner's office, where she would never wish to go into generally, and take pictures and be taken seriously, because her identity has shifted from student to photographer. And of course, it's a photographer with power, because if you have that video camera, you have a resource, and it means that either you have money or you know somebody who has money, and that gives you some power in that context. So in terms of some of the logistics of the stories that we do have stories that can be identified by first words and phrases, sentences, beginning paragraphs. So we have stories not only in multiple languages, but also at multiple levels, so depending on what the needs of a community are. And what I love about this particular image, because it reminds me of Dr. Matsitsi, the talk that we had yesterday about the images of of the wood on the women's heads. And what we see here is that what we're looking at is how you can use images to scaffold meaning. So you can have a look at the original text, for example. A long time ago, 3 girls went to collect wood. When they had collected enough wood, they tied it into bundles and put it on their heads. So there's quite a lot of complex language there. But if you simply just go with a long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. And so the images carry the meaning. So what we are focusing on here is meaning making and the engagement of children as meaning makers. And we're looking then at a multimodal model where you are drawing on not only text but images. It's also bilingual meaning making as well. So this is an example of, in fact, a story that was donated by Alexander McCall Smith. Some of you might know his work with the Botswana Ladies Detective Agency. And you see here, 2 different languages side by side in a again, a very kind of creative integration of text and image. So in terms of constructs of reading, somebody asked me yesterday, would you call yourself an expert on reading? Do I have that identity? But what I would say is that for me, what we have is a commitment to reading as meaning making. Because one of the things I have learned in considerable research that I've done many years is that if children think that reading is, you read word by word by word, they lose the sense of reading as being constructed and also a meaning-making project. So what you're wanting kids to understand is that reading is about the construction of meaning, and that if you're reading, although it's helpful, of course, at some point you will be reading word by word, and I'm sure you're going to be talking a little bit about that, Mary, but also that you do want kids to construct meaning. And that also means that kids need to have a sense of ownership over the process. They need to feel that they are readers, not that they are decoders. Yes, you have to do some decoding, but you want kids to develop the say, I'm a reader. And I remember even with my daughter when she started reading Archie comics, and she said, Mom, and she had collected all these little stories and she had it in a little library, and she said, I'm a reader. And I thought, that's what you want. That's the identity that you want for young people. And there's that sense of ownership. So what we have here then is, in terms, again, thinking of ownership, is that as people contribute to this project, they also have a sense of ownership of what they write. So, for example, we've got an open access system here. So you have the writer, the name of the writer is recognized, the name of the illustrator is recognized, but we also have a Creative Commons license so that anybody can use these stories, but they have to acknowledge where they come from and who the writer is and who the illustrators are. So we also have partners, that we have to work with partners to actually make sure that this has the impact that we need globally. And Pratt & Books is one of our partners, and in fact is going to be doing the presentation, the final keynote today. And so that's a very exciting partnership. And this is where we shift to, perfect. This is where we shift to what is called the global ASP, which, as I say, was developed by Liam Doherty. So what has Liam done with this particular project? And again, you see everything is online. What he said is, look, all these stories are open access, so anybody can use them. And what he's also identified, which never really sunk in, as far as I was concerned, are all the open access images that we have on this website. There are over 4,000 images that are now open access. So what he's arguing is that the stories, of course, are wonderful, well illustrated and interesting. Why would we not perhaps use them in other contexts as well? So what he's done is, we started just in August 2015. We started with 5 languages and 29 translations. In September, we had 11 languages and 78 translations. And November, which was just last month, 16 languages and 162 translations. So what are those languages? We've got Cantonese, Mandarin, Danish, Esperanto, German, Hindi, Japanese, Nepali, Norwegian, Persian. So the sky's the limit. Everybody in this room can get onto the global ASP and translate, adapt, change, enjoy these stories. In fact, I'm actually going to Beijing next week, and I'm going to be telling my Chinese colleagues, all about the African Storybook, and the fact that we've got a good number. I think we might even have 80 stories in Mandarin. And just thought I would show, since we are in India, I would show you our Hindi-English books. We have a number of Hindi-English books, but to show you, how kind of exciting it is, right, to see, again, a bilingual text in the Hindi script and also in English. What makes this possible is the fact that Liam has developed a translation app, and to make it easier, he's got this very simple but sophisticated translation app. And what you see, this is just an example of it in use. So what you have here is, you sign on, you say, okay, you want to translate that story, what target language do you want to use, there's your name, you put your name in, and then you would translate, as sentence by sentence, and you submit. That's it. And then what he's done is created an image bank explorer, so that, for example, you want to write a story about libraries. So you just type in the word library, and then you come up with a gallery of pictures that all reference reading, libraries, and so forth. So you're tapping into the 4,200 open access images that are available on African Storybook. So in terms of finishing up with my part of the presentation, what we committed to is promoting literacy in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is our passion and our commitment, and where we put huge amounts of energy. But we want to encourage local ownership of meaning too, through working with partners and local communities. My vision, as well as I think to Sadie, is democratizing the flow of ideas through sharing ASP early literacy model to other regions of the world. Because in Africa, learns a lot, from many other parts of the world. But there's also something really wonderful and exciting about Africa contributing meaningfully to innovations in other parts of the world. And this is such an exciting, important innovation that has emerged from the African context. But we see also through the global ASP that it certainly has potential for the world. So I'm going to hand over now to Mary, who's going to give an example of how this now works in Nepal.
So it's not a fantasy. The potential can be put to work right away in your community. And the Nepal Education Support Trust USA has developed an early literacy curriculum with a dual language framework because of the potential that we have from the technology of the project. And we also do teacher training, and I have a little brochure with an article on our teacher training down here, because that's not the focus of the presentation. And there you see our wonderful teachers in their training situation. I am enamored of this project because the technology allows curriculum developers to translate, in our case, to translate stories into Nepali and other Nepalese languages so that the students can hear the story in their home language and teachers can guide comprehension to deeper meaning. And the potential is so great because once they've had the story in the Nepali language that is their home language, we who are doing English language literacy can adapt difficult vocabulary and complex stories to appropriate levels for our learners. And on our website, which you will find down at the end of the presentation and down there, you will find examples of the original story in English and in Nepali, and then you will see examples of the adapted story, where we have kept the complex meaning, but adapted the vocabulary so that the children can more easily acquire the vocabulary in English. I'm going to talk about one particular story, which is called Grandma's Bananas, which gives us a model of the possibilities of using these wonderful books. It has real-world connections as characters' actions and thoughts are explored. It's, of all things, the most important thing maybe is it's so relevant to children's lives. And many of these stories revolve around universal themes, but in this case, it's children's curiosity, temptation, and its consequences, which gives opportunities to discuss and role-play the ideas in the story and alternative actions that the characters in it might have taken. It promotes dialogue, and a deeper meaning is gained from hearing and discussions. This will already have taken place in their home language. So we involve partnerships between the Nepali language teachers and those teachers who are teaching the English language, which is something I've tried for 10 years and hasn't happened before. There are other stories that are available that we have worked with called, and here's one, The Elephant Bird, which is from the Pratham project. And here you see that we've translated it into Nepali, and we have Nepali and English on the same page to the extent that we can. And obviously, we're working from the theoretical notion that with the transfer of skills between languages helps develop each language, and in particular, the English language skills that we're trying to develop. And in our case, we're doing it in the context of schools, and we're building, in fact, a curriculum around these stories for pre-K through grade 3, but in many cases, the stories are applicable at least through grade 7. We've worked with the stories through grade 7. We provide evidence-based literacy practices and training on them. And it is a curriculum which has accessible resources for teachers because it's all on our website, the stories, the teacher's guide, the applications, the questions, everything is on there. And it supports teachers who are themselves also English language learners. I can't emphasize enough how this opens possibilities, because we have complex and meaningful stories in and of themselves, supported by extraordinarily beautiful illustrations. In this case, they're in an African context, but I can tell you that the children in Nepal thought that these characters were much more accessible than all of the English storybooks that we bring over. And research does support us that complexity in picture books is a quality shared between the reader, text, and the images. And you'll see comments from the teachers in the end that supports this very reference. They're wonderful books for getting to different levels of meaning. We can start with what does the text say, questions and comments about the story characters, the setting and events, and retelling the story, which of course is where we really want to get the children to use the vocabulary of their own language and the vocabulary in English. We go to a different level. How do the text and illustrations work together to create meaning? But most importantly, what does the text mean? Making inferences. What is the author's message? What can we learn from the main character? And how can we support our inferences with evidence from the book, both the text and the illustrations? So Grandma's Bananas is the one we ended up with using first. And here we have a wonderful illustration, and we could ask the children to tell us what they think it means. But we see a girl who has done something that gave her pleasure, but in the end, she has to face her grandma and her parents and account for the consequences of her actions. We learn how to develop a vocabulary around character and setting. And we would hope that children would be able, because they've already had exposure in their own language, they would be able to describe what they think might be going on with that character. She's clearly visiting her grandmother. We happen to know, because we've already read it in Nepali, that she was curious to know how her grandma ripened the bananas, but grandma didn't answer her questions. And that helps develop vocabulary and sentence structure in English. And you can see here's a teacher who took the story. She's a preschool teacher. This would be kindergarten in the way I described grades. And she's already got children to understand words like ask, pick, watch, hide. Great vocabulary development. And we always, when we deliver instruction to our teachers, we ask them to give us evidence that they have used the books and materials and strategies that we have introduced, so they send us photos. I found that if you ask them to write you an email, it may not come. But if I just ask them to send me a photo that they take on their camera, it comes right away. We work with using evidence to understand story characters and their traits. So what do you see in that picture? You see a child raising a leaf and looking in, and she's trying to find the bananas. And we develop vocabulary and the ability to retell by helping the children understand connecting words and how to use them. So Nala, the little girl, she's curious. So she wants to know how grandma ripens bananas, but grandma doesn't want to tell her because grandma likes to have mysteries. And so very gradually, we are introducing the children's ability in both of their languages to explain, justify, think. Because, so you can't argue with this for encouraging you to try and use the books in your context. Here's the lead teacher who would have been here today with us, but for the situation in Nepal is just too difficult. She said, "We have not had books like the African Storybook project before. Therefore, we were limited in helping the children to analyze text and connecting it to their lives." Now, that's fairly obviously sophisticated comment, but she has 2 masters. But she is the lead teacher in one of the schools that we're working in, and she's a real partner in this whole project. So after we deliver the workshops, we always have the teachers reflect on what they learned and what they got from it. And here are 2 examples. The first is when this teacher was reflecting on really the moral of the story for her, which was that children have a right to get answers. And if they do not get the answers, they will act on their own, and it may be right or wrong. And in this story, a child is helped to see the consequences of acting on their own. Now, she didn't use the word impulses, but I would have, but we tried to keep to their language. And how about this for a response from a teacher? We, the teachers, need to think about the motivations of characters. If we don't think, then they won't think. And you'll see our curriculum for teacher ed is described in one of my brochures. So my organization, the Nepal Education Support Trust USA, is building on the African Storybook Project model by creating informational texts on global topics, which uses the same principles of the African Storybook Project, which is that they're open access, and we will hopefully work with your techie people so that others can adapt these stories. But at the moment, they're just available on our website. And in this particular example, we focus on conservation to show that children can and should take action to save the environment around them. And in this case, it's about the red panda, which is in danger of going extinct in Nepal, which is terrible. So here is the story. Here they're wonderful South Asian characters. And there is access to all of this material on our websites, nestusa.org or wordscientist.org. Again, they're in my brochure down there. So at this point, I can say thank you for your attention. Bonnie and I would love to take your questions, and we'll all be going for lunch afterwards. So if you care to join us and see how you could use this project in your world, we would be very happy to have you with us, because we don't want to be just talking about things, we want to be doing things. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, both of you, for a very interesting, thought-provoking and enthusiastically delivered, very warmly and enthusiastically delivered talk on this wonderful project. No limitations to this project except those that we impose ourselves. It's there, it's ready. Do I have some questions from the audience? Thank you. Do we have, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's really, really interesting to hear about it. A question for Mary. Aside from the photographs that you mentioned that the teachers send in from the classrooms, what other monitoring and evaluation tools do you use to see the impact of the teacher training that you do with the stories to then see it actually go out into the classroom?
Well, what we do is we give the teachers recommended exercises that we think would be appropriate after they use the stories. So using Grandma's Bananas, we asked the teachers to encourage the children to write about that which they would be able to do if they don't understand why an adult is telling them to do something. So we bring it to application in the classroom, and then we get these pieces back, and we're analyzing them into categories of responses to find out how we should do our in-service better, but also to account for the kind of work that we do. And the lead teacher whose name you saw there, she's very interested in helping the children to develop independently and to develop their own personalities and identities. So we will be looking for those themes as well as we move through. So we've only 2 books at the moment, but it's looking good.
Any more questions? Gentleman there, and then...
Thank you very much for a beautiful presentation. It's not the first time I hear about a project. It's quite exciting. I grew up listening to stories told my grandmother, and part of my way of doing things is thanks to these stories. There are a few things I would like you to clarify. One is that you say we can access the stories, translate them, adapt them. what is the mechanism for quality control? Because translating is an art by itself. I speak some kind of English and some kind of Portuguese, but I wouldn't qualify as a translator or anything like that. The other thing was the quote from UNICEF. I don't know what is your position about that. But as I said yesterday, one of the biggest troubles in Africa when it comes to mother tongue-based education is that we use the mother tongue or bilingual or multilingual education, whatever we want to call it, to address pedagogical problems. We say people don't learn because they start learning in a language they don't know, so they have to start with their mother tongue so that they can learn better Portuguese, English, French, they still can go on. Now the question is, if there were no pedagogical problems, what would you do with the entire communities whose life revolves around their languages? The other thing I wanted you to request is that in terms of partnerships, I think I mentioned this to Bonny once, it is a very beautiful work, but I'm not sure whether it gets into the mainstream curriculum, education, because the way we do it is a project, and we need to find some ways of engaging the decision makers. One of the things about one of the things about our curriculum is that you don't find this type of things which are quite interesting and in terms of content. I'm sorry, the list is quite long. The other thing is your illustrations. Do you use the same illustrations for all the countries? Do you adapt them? What happens? I was thinking about the young girl and the chicken following the grandmother. When I was growing up, it was always me and the chicken who went ahead so that my grandmother could protect us and see what is coming. If we were to stay behind, a wolf or a dog could snatch us without her seeing that. So if you show that image in some parts of Africa, people will ask you where you got it from. The other thing which is related to translation is, you see, there's been a big challenge when it comes to writing African languages, because you need to make sure that in order for them to develop, you have got a standard way of writing them. I think I mentioned this to Bonny when we first met somewhere, that Akalan where I was working, we were trying to standardize the writing system. That helps a language. So if there are many people writing, how do you control? I can translate, the other one write in his way. How do we have any quality control in place? Sorry, the list was quite long. But because your talk is very interesting, it invites a lot of questions. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'll stand up, if you don't mind, because I think others in the group. Well, first of all, my response is, do you think you might be available to join the board? Because that's the issue. Because what you've raised are just multiple interesting issues that we have certainly grappled with, we grapple with constantly. And what I can at least do is to take you through this journey, how we're addressing many of these issues, but we certainly don't have the answers to all these issues. But we would love to have you on board, Dr. Mazzini. So hold that thought. Okay, so let's go through them one by one. The quality control. Talk about complex, because on the one hand you're saying create your own stories, and then is somebody going to adapt it? Is somebody going to check it out? Are there going to be problems with it? So what we've done at Sadie is we've got, in a sense, two categories. We're still not entirely comfortable with this, but we do have the concept of ASP approved, an ASP approved story. In other words, for a variety of reasons, whether it's the nature of the images, the nature of the text, the nature of the story, we feel that many people would be comfortable with this story. But we don't exclude those that may not necessarily meet those standards. It's complex, right? I could spend just an hour talking about that particular issue, but it is something that we're trying to grapple with the concept of ASB approved. The issue of the pedagogical issues, for me, and I think for many of us, the issue is really less about pedagogy narrowly defined as it is about learning. It's about engagement. It's about excitement. It's about connecting kids to their world and to other worlds as well. So if you think that that's pedagogy, that's great. If you're thinking of pedagogy in very narrow kinds of ways, I think our project really lends itself to many different ways of thinking about pedagogy. But the most important being that we have the child at the center. That everything is about how do we engage the child, excite the child, harness the talents of the child. So, and because that child is the future of our world. So we would need to think about definitions. The second was, one was illustrations. The question of illustration, interestingly enough, in Uganda, we had a case where one of the images, one of the stories had a picture of a cow, but it was only a half a picture. You know, pictures sometimes, represent just. And the ministry said no, they wanted the whole cow, because people might get confused because there's half a cow, right? So then we had to kind of create another image, with the full cow and color it in, right? So we try to work with people. Some people might be fine to have half a cow in an image, but if somebody would like us to have a full cow, we do it. Or that's the possibility of an organic model that you can constantly change and improve. The translation is also it's complex. What we did, like with one of our partners is called Translators Without Borders. And what we've done with a lot of our stories is handed it over to this organization. They've translated many, many stories into French. And these are qualified translators. Now, there are many people out there in the world who are not qualified. But what we found is that when people do translation, they tend to work not alone, but with 2 or 3 people, and sometimes even in a group. And they come to kind of a consensus about what would be the appropriate translation for this particular story. But we can also know that, of course, any language has different forms of a language. So some people might say, this language represents the English spoken in Kampala, or the Uganda spoken in Kampala, but what about different forms of the language in other parts of the country? Well, you can change it. And that's the organic nature, is that you can have different forms. Or if you, for example, refer to a cow by one term and somebody else refers to it by another term, well, you simply just adapt. Let me see here. Did you say? Oh, yes, huge issue, and I'm mainstreaming. Now, you've really hit our greatest challenge, which is we've got this amazing resource. We've 400 stories which keep growing, but we do want to get them into the schools. We have to work with teacher education institutions. We have to be involved. We can't do everything, right? Because there's a team of people, an amazing team of people. But at the same time, it's only a dozen people working 24/7. And Africa is huge, right? Hundreds and hundreds of institutions, thousands of institutions. That's why, for example, I'm at this particular conference to reach out to policymakers, to teachers, to institutions, to say, come on board, kind of work with us, or just take it, use it as a resource, and adapt it. But keep us in the loop, because what we want more than anything else is that people don't reinvent the wheel. So that if you're learning in Ghana, that this is a good way. For example, Nepal, how great. How can we learn from the work that you're doing in Nepal? About 3 levels of meaning, about using connecting words, about images, how we incorporate images, so that teachers can learn in other parts of Africa and the world. So that's why we want to keep the conversation going, so that we can also learn from what is happening in other parts of the world. But you can also upload it. We are constantly trying to develop videos. to show people how you can use these stories, but we kind of, we want to develop partnerships so that the impact is extensive. Sorry about that. But you did ask lots of questions. Sorry about that, everybody.
I'm sorry, Chair, but the digital part of it also is a big challenge. I don't know the people who work in this domain, how many of us in the world have access to cell phones and that. And books, printed books, carry power, carry symbolic power. In my village, there are illiterate people who walk around with books to have this status so they can read. So one of the way to disseminate your work is to consider the possibility of printing as many stories as possible. Sorry, Chair.
Maybe I'll just make a comment, because I'm sure you're all wondering. Yes, absolutely. But one of the things that's exciting is that the digital is changing. You know what Africa's like, right? 10 years ago, I couldn't Skype with anybody in Africa, and now I can have a Skype every day, with my colleagues in different parts of Africa. So it's not perfect, but the world is changing, and there is huge excitement. And just the digital phones, right? We know that at the moment they don't have the power to do what needs to be done with these stories, but even that is changing, and they are getting cheaper. And so we're kind of at a point where, in fact, the developments in the digital converge with the needs, and we kind of be at the forefront, really. But we don't exclude the print, and I agree with you 100%. To the extent that we can get books out, print, digital, whatever, oral forms, it is great, because you want kids to enjoy learning. And if we could get publishers, who can publish, they can take them, publish them. They're free. So if ministers want to use it, print them out. So not for one moment do we think that we're beyond the print world. Do you want to make a comment on that? Yeah.
Not necessarily about the printed word, but I'm just going to be a little revolutionary here. And I'm saying that we can't wait for teacher education institutions to change. We can work with them. But we're making the training available through a very simple technology called Zoom. And we will be having a training on Grandma's Bananas on December 2nd. So if you wish to join, all you have to do is download this free technology, give us your email address, and you can be part of our process of bringing ways of teaching with and about stories to as many teachers as we can. So we're trying in our own way to influence teacher education institutions, but we can't wait while they change. We have to change. I think there's a person here who said yesterday, Carol Benson, if you're not following your own agenda, you're following someone else's.
I think we have one question here, and I don't know if there are more in the room, but certainly one here who's been waiting very patiently, and the lady at the back after that. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Musna, and I'm from the University of Mauritius. So I think it's a wonderful project. It reminds me of my reading of extensive book projects and book floods. And the advantage of your project is that it's free. I have two questions for you. The first question is, do you hope to extend the project to beyond early literacy, which I think would be fascinating? And my second question is, and I'll just follow from my colleague here, have you started evaluating the impact of children who are reading your books, the impact on their language proficiency? Because I think that will give you fascinating results, and I would love to read the results. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. The interesting thing about the data that we've got is that a lot of older kids are reading those stories, because a lot of kids who have kind of missed out on English, and quite frankly, they're such great stories. They're fun, I sit and read those stories, and that's part of the logic, is that parents can read with kids. But you're talking about the later age, absolutely. But at the moment, we're focusing on the early literacy, because that's really where the huge need is. As you saw from the stats, we've already lost 60% of kids, by the time they reach grade 4. So that's the focus. But, absolutely. And everything depends on, in a sense, the resources that we get. Because, there's only, we're human beings, you know what I mean? But we're doing our very best. And the impact is something that we do want to follow up, and will be part of what we hope will be the second part of the project, and to actually follow up. But now the issue is getting the stories out, getting people excited, getting people using them. And we are doing some research I'm doing with my student Espen Stranger Johansson, is looking at changes in teacher identity. Because it's not just the kids, right? It's that how are teachers working with these stories, and how does their sense, right, of what it means to be a teacher and to be a reading teacher change as they work with these new technologies and new stories. So I'll be able to report next year. Thank you. I think there was, yes.
You saw the comments of the teachers that were on my part, how they're changing their conceptions of what you get from reading, which is wonderful to be part of.
There's a question from the lady in the back, and then also from Nicola. We have the...
Can I go?
Yes,
Yep.
and then the lady who's been
Thank
waiting.
you.
Yeah.
That's, I find it a very optimistic approach, so thank you for the presentation. You just mentioned, Bonnie, parents and children, and I'm wondering what scope there is, or if you have tried anything in terms of the family literacy approach with this work.
Well, interestingly enough, we are very interested in communities, so not just parents, but also libraries. We're working not only with schools, but libraries too, because libraries might be a place where parents might feel comfortable coming in with their children. And so that is, in a sense, a family literacy model. Doing research is a little more difficult when you're working with families because there isn't the same kind of institutional structure that you have within schools. But what I hope is that if schools become actively involved in the project, they can also bring parents on board. They can invite the parents into their parent-teacher evenings, they can do workshops, they can make the parents feel part of the school community. Because one of the issues and one of the challenges in Africa and many parts of the world is that many parents don't feel they're part of the school community. They feel they're kind of outside of that and they have very little to contribute. So this is a way that you can bridge the kind of home-school relationships and in very exciting ways. But that's in a sense, for the next stage of the project. But it's absolutely on the radar. Yeah. I think there was somebody up there.
Hi, I'm Vandana. My question is regarding African Story Project. Basically, what I could understand is you develop stories for enhancing reading habit in children, and especially in practicing the reading skills in both the languages. My question is, has any work been done, or is there any thought of doing work on developing decodables and early reading books, especially for grade 1 children who don't have a preschool background, especially when they're just learning to read? And I think that these type of stories will really help in actually helping them able to pick up the reading skill in their home language or the second language. And secondly, I would be also very interested in knowing, since I also work in an organization which set up libraries, and we procure books and we give it to children to read in libraries, and almost in a similar pattern, same storybooks, but what we mostly we are not able to gauge is how much of reading skills or probably that meaning making happens, and how children are able to achieve their outcome that we want to achieve, to be a reader, to be an independent reader.
I can address the first part of your question, and then together we'll address the making meaning. But the Nepal Education Support Trust USA, our books will be addressing just that issue of how to learn to read with meaningful text and pictures that carry the meaning, but with, it's carefully sequenced vocabulary. So if you check out the Red Panda book on our website, nestusa.org, you'll see an example of what we hope to do a lot more of. And also the books in the African Story Project are leveled to a certain degree. So there's first words, first sentences, early paragraph reading, able to read on your own independently. So there's going to be the resources that we need, within the year to be able to address your question. Now, the making meaning, I did address some of that in the ways we go down in levels of meaning. And the example I gave to the first questioner was, how do we get the children to make the meaning? We get the teachers to draw a moral that they may take from the story, but they turn it over to the children to take whatever moral they get and to bring it into their own lives. And it's really rather special when you do it that way.
And perhaps what I could add to that, which I loved about what Mary was talking about, was the notion of evidence. Because if a kid says, this is what the story means to me, you can listen respectfully, and then you'll need to ask why, right? So the kid has to go back to the text, right, and say, well, this, I can connect with that, or I can connect, and then they'll realize, oh, perhaps they misread something. Oh, they thought it was this, but it's that. So you are engaging with the text meaningfully, but also you have to kind of thoughtfully look at the text and see, what is the story, or what is actually being said in the text. So I think the question of evidence helps you to bridge that gap between the meaning making on the one hand and the skill level. I think in quite an exciting way.
We have one last question and then we'll have to stop there, but you can certainly carry on during lunch.
Mike, I think it's more an observation or sharing of some experience in India of doing stories at the lower levels of education. I think our books, which are quite modern, I must say, have lots and lots of stories. That's not a problem. But then I think the crux of the problem is how you sort of bring that story alive to the children and how you help them to make meaning, rather than you giving them some kind of a fixed meaning that according to you lies there in the text already. I think in that sense, teacher training or enabling the teacher to sort of understand the philosophy, like the notion of evidence or meaning making or the top-down kind of reading, because I think a lot of language education and reading and stories definitely are part of it, but then here it is a lot of word to sentence to meaning, which is, I think, problematic with meaning making. And therefore, I believe that if you can enable the teacher to sort of understand it and then do different things in the classroom, a lot of it is achieved. In India, I think even stories, as I said, books have lots and lots of stories, but there's already a kind of a stereotyped meaning put into it, and that's what the teacher unearths for the students, and it is fixed. And it is never explored by students and the teacher and so on. There's a moral that the teacher gives, and that's the question that's asked on, and what's the moral of the story kind of thing. So I know that you're struggling with different levels of, challenges, right from what that gentleman mentioned about, the government sort of understanding the importance of this and so on. But I think teacher training to me is the most challenging, more important one here. There could be good books, as I said, Indian books, quite good, but then it's really rests with the teacher how she or he makes or breaks it.
And this for me is thank you for that wonderful observation. For me, what's so exciting is that, I do a lot of work in social theory, and there's somebody called Derrida, that I read constantly, and he says every reading is a rereading. And so if you think what that model, right, that in fact reading and meaning is something that is co-constructed, if teachers even get to the point of thinking, how do we theorize meaning making, right? That was already an important step, that a kid will read something from perhaps a very different perspective, and that should be encouraged. Yes, you want kids to provide the evidence, but at the same time, you want to provide latitude for different ways of relating to that story. Because otherwise, children are going to spend the entire time saying, how should I read this text? How does the teacher want me to read it? So that you lose your connection with the text, because your first question is, how does the teacher want me to read it? So what we have to do is have a different model of reading, which is how to encourage the kids' sense that I do have the sense of ownership. This is what the text means to me. But they also have to provide the evidence. They've got to explain it, they've got to go back to it, and I think that's where the excitement lies. But it's a different theory of meaning making, a different theory of reading, that there is not only one way of reading a text. And I think that these stories actually allow one to actually experiment with meaning making in that way.
Thank you very much to the audience for your very useful and thought-provoking questions, and to our two wonderful speakers. I'm sure you're going to go away with lots of food for thought. We're going to lunch a little bit late. Thank you for being patient. If you're going on long journeys by bus or train or plane, write a story, translate one of your stories, send it to them. They want to get beyond the 404, 500 by the end of the week maybe. Please join me by giving them a huge round of applause. And a small token, the famous photo.